Hi, my name is Kirsten. I'm a freelance photojournalist based here in Brooklyn. And I'm going to talk to you today about the work that I've done along the US-Mexico border. And before I lived in New York, from 2006 to 2008, I worked as a staff photographer for a small paper in McAllen, Texas, on the Mexican border. And that was my initial connection to this area. The way that I approach this work is through different chapters that I'll then go ahead and package and pitch to different publications. So I'm going to sort of move through it in that same format. After I left in 2008, I would visit whenever possible, but the work that I was doing wasn't really, first of all, it wasn't that good. And also, I wasn't really getting much attention because nobody knew about this part of the border. Has anyone here ever been to the border? Great.
This is shocking.
So a lot of a lot of the attention has been focused on Juarez, and not to diminish the real and utter violence that's happened there. This area received a lot less attention, partly because there's been a lot of media censorship on the Mexican side. So the violence that had started to build, starting in about 2008, was not really receiving the same attention that other parts of the border were receiving. So it was harder to get people's attention when I talked about this part of the border. I was in Mexico working on a completely unrelated story when the New York Times called me and sent me back to McAllen to work on a story about border security. So I'm going to show you some images from working with the Border Patrol and looking at border security through their perspective. This is something that we stumbled upon, somebody actually jumping into a vehicle. These are migrant shelters in Reynosa, across the border. What we did was compare security in Tijuana and in South Texas. Tijuana used to be the busiest crossing point, and now it's actually in South Texas. And they talked about the terrain and how much difficulty that would cause any law enforcement that was working in the area. So what I learned when I was working with the Border Patrol in McAllen was that the migration routes had in fact shifted towards South Texas, where I used to live, and it was now the busiest crossing point. A lot of that was because Central Americans are crossing there. It's the most direct route through Mexico. And they were responding by sending more and more law enforcement to this area. This would be where they process the migrants after they're apprehended. So as you can imagine, when you're working in this area, there's a lot of bureaucracy. I'm reliant on access from law enforcement to do this sort of work. But they're also a wealth of information. And so when I was doing this story in McAllen, I was really curious as to what had happened and what was changing. And I got incredible access because I was working for the New York Times. So they started talking to me about the phenomenon of stash houses. And in South Texas in particular, there are two separate checkpoints, one along the river and then one about 80 miles north in the middle of nowhere, essentially along the highway headed out of this area. And what that means is that any migrant that's crossing in this area has to cross effectively twice. They have to circumvent the Border Patrol at the river and then blend in, and their coyotes or their smugglers have to actually drive them up to a remote area, drop them off, and they have to hike around this second checkpoint. So this was all from that assignment for the New York Times, where I was given access to both Border Patrol, they took me out and showed me all these things, and also they gave me all this information. And that's where I found my next story. I decided to go back and try to find out what was happening in these stash houses, why they were so prevalent, and what they looked like. When I had lived in South Texas, we had heard stories about these houses, and maybe 2 or 3 times a year there would be a big bust where 50 or 100 people were found hiding in these homes. We would get a handout photo usually that would circulate on the AP that was taken by law enforcement. And of course, as a photographer, I wanted to see it for myself. It's extremely hard to get access. So at this point, I started brainstorming, and I returned to the area, and I decided to go in through local law enforcement, and I had lots of contacts there from working for the newspaper for years. So I went in with the sheriff's department and some of the small town police departments that have much less bureaucracy, and they would allow me to go with them on these raids and to witness the conditions in these houses. So these are bottles of urine. Typically, these houses are abandoned. Anywhere from 5 to 100 people could be crammed in there. There's usually not running water. The purpose of these houses is to hide people in plain sight, and they can pay whatever it is that they owe, the remainder of what they owe, to their smugglers, and they can sort of regroup for a couple of days before they're taken on the final portion of the journey. Unfortunately, most of these houses, there's a lot of exploitation, there's sexual abuse, there's physical abuse. When they call your family to pay the remainder of what you owe them, the fee can go up dramatically. And if you don't pay the money, of course, then you will not be released. I was particularly interested in this story because I think that there's a lot of compassion fatigue for what happens to migrants in Mexico when they're traveling through. We've probably seen images of La Bestia, the train, that migrants are robbed and abused when they're going through Mexico. But I don't know that many people realize the extent of how this is occurring on American soil. So the first nights in the US, when arguably these people are at their most vulnerable because they've made it this far and they're so close to gaining entry to the country, and they're on American soil and they're facing conditions like this. So this was completed over several weeks in 2013 and eventually ran in Harper's Magazine as a portfolio. And after that ran, I was more committed to covering basically this period in history where the Rio Grande Valley was becoming the sort of stage for this political drama. Like, all of a sudden people are talking about this area. It's in the news. This last summer, there's something like 50,000 unaccompanied children, which you may have heard about. That was happening in McAllen, Texas. Obama responded by calling it a humanitarian crisis and pledging billions of dollars. This is what that looked like. There were indeed hundreds and hundreds of people each day turning themselves in, seeking asylum from the Border Patrol on the banks of the Rio Grande, just outside of McAllen, Texas. So these people would be, they would not be going into the stash houses because they're crossing and turning themselves in. They're taking another approach that's, in their opinion, a little safer. They wouldn't probably put their children through the stash house system. So just to back up 1 second, when I went down to cover this, there was a lot of media. I mean, this summer was probably when McAllen had the most media that they have ever seen. And when Obama made those comments and all this money started flooding into the area, there was more and more attention. The Border Patrol didn't really know how to handle all the media, and it wasn't exactly great PR for them to be arresting or apprehending children. So they were not allowing a lot of media, so I had to, again, circumvent that and go through local law enforcement and get these images. And what was interesting there is that I think once they realized that I was going to do it anyways, then they started contacting me directly, and they said, well, wait a minute, what do you want to work on? And then I saw for once, because they had kept denying my request. So then at that point, I had decided I really wanted to do some aerial work to try to explain the landscape and sort of how complicated it is. When you speak to people outside of the border about what to do, you'll find that everyone has an opinion on immigration. Many people offer some sort of solution, but very few people have actually been there or seen whether or not that's feasible. So you'll hear, let's put a wall up, or let's let them all in. Either one of those options are a bit absurd. So I decided to try to explain this by showing more expansive landscapes and to show the different resources and how they're being used on the ground. So this last year, they employed the National Guard and the Texas State Guard in the area, and there were actually more of a military-style presence in this area than there's ever been before, more money being spent than ever before. So these images show that. I took this all from Border Patrol helicopters. And what these agents will look for is fresh sign, as they call it, which are tracks. And then they'll mark it on the GPS and report to ground agents to go investigate that area. So here they're tracking footprints for a group that had fled a traffic stop. And this is in the middle of the Rio Grande. This man was actually swimming back to Mexico because he had been spotted by ground agents, and he was making his way back to Mexico. Agents cannot pursue anyone into the river as an international boundary, and most savvy people or smugglers know this. So once you're in the Rio Grande, you're basically safe. And same thing where he was spotted by the helicopter, so he had turned back, and he was headed back to Mexico. And these people took their raft out of the river and put it back in their car and drove off, so they'll try again later. So what I hope to do with this was, when we read that Obama has pledged $50 billion, I want to show exactly what that looks like, where this money is going towards, and to hopefully show that it's a little bit more complicated than we think it is. This gentleman is turning himself in, like we saw this summer, so he was seeking asylum. And this was when we actually used the downdraft of the helicopter to flatten the reeds to search for a group that they had been tracking but had lost track of. So this is right when the pilot spotted them. And this is the border wall itself. In this particular part of Texas, the border wall is built atop of a levee. That's how they could get it approved politically, because a lot of the community would get behind the idea of bolstering their levees, which needed to be repaired, but they would not get behind the idea of having a border fence per se. So that's what they've done here. There's about a 20-foot drop, and it sort of causes the part of the migrant traffic to be sort of filtered in one direction or other. So it makes it a little bit easier for them to maintain vigilance in the area.
Wow.
So
Incredible work.
thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'll wait for you to.
Okay. There you go.
Great. So, something that I was reading, I think you were interviewed for Time magazine about your work a while back, and something you talked about was not getting a lot of attention to your work until all of a sudden there was this spotlight on immigration within the last, year in particular. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that's like to be working on an issue and be so committed to it and not have too many people responding to it right away, and then sort of being the person that everybody's kind of coming to.
Well, I think that I was working quite a bit when I was down there, and I was trying to explain to reporters and editors sort of how violence was starting to spike and how it was becoming a lot busier down there. They just hadn't heard of the area, So it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't until the summer when we saw these images of women and children did people really start paying attention. And it's been interesting. I mean, I really enjoy collaborating with editors that have an open mind about what they're looking for. So I've had people approach me saying, like, I'd like to do something based on the migrants. I don't know if we can get them, in the detention center, and I'll tell them quickly, like, we can't do that, but this is what we can do. And because I've sort of tried to get access so many different ways that we can work together to figure out how we can tell the story most effectively. So I really enjoy being part of the dialogue.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder if, when you start seeing media sort of descend upon the area and you notice that access is getting more difficult, how do you, obviously you came up with some creative ways of getting in there, but, how do you start to set your work apart when a bunch of people who are excellent photographers, as you are, how do you set your work apart so that people are paying attention?
Well, I want to start by saying that I'm very pleased when there's more media attention in the area, and I have many colleagues, and I will help them however I can to cover these stories, because I do think it's really important. But yeah, I think that's part of the reason why I had the idea to do these aerials, because I knew that it had to look different if I was going to keep sort of maintaining the attention of editors and readers. And I also knew that I was spending a lot of time explaining to people why a wall may or may not work, or explaining these methods employed by the Border Patrol, some of which are incredibly low tech, mixed with these really high tech tools that they get from Department of Defense or all this funding coming from the federal government. So I was spending so much time explaining it that that's where I sort of realized that I needed to make images that could tell that story. So I would talk to people, and if I repeated myself 3 times with different editors, I realized, well, then I'm not doing a good job. So this is what I need to show in these pictures. Right. I wasn't explaining how the river is extremely accessible, especially on the Mexican side. People are swimming there every day. People are bathing. There's no cooperation. You can tell them that, but you have to show them that. So that's what I wanted to do. And I couldn't really do that. On the Mexican side, it's quite dangerous to be on your own along the river, because there's scouts informally employed by the cartels, because they're moving a lot of drugs and migrants to the area. So I can't safely go shoot daily life on the river like I used to when I worked for the paper. You can't do that anymore. So I was like, well, the best way to show this would be from the air.
When you first started working in the area, when you were on the ground and you were working for the paper, it was relatively dangerous then, but not how it is now. But what was it like? What was it like then? When did you?
Yeah, it was like night and day. We would regularly, when we had a slow day in the office, we would cross to Mexico to go find a feature story, and we would visit the orphanages or stop in at local politicians and ask them what was going on. And somebody we'd meet some friends for dinner. I'd go see a journalist friend. I would go on foot or in my own car. And things are really different now. If you'll notice, most of these images are from Texas for 2 reasons. One is safety, and also because I'm actually extremely intrigued by what happens on American. So I feel like by showing American readers that it might impact them more than if they see things, like I said, that are happening in Mexico. I think it's a lot easier to dismiss that. So a lot of my concentration has been in Texas for both safety reasons and because I think it has more of an impact.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's another thing. It's obviously an issue that people have very strong opinions about, but not necessarily always with a lot of information behind it. There's just a gut reaction. And I think like Natalie has done, where you make something a little bit more personal, you have some quieter moments, or you pull way back and you're really showing, this is the topography, this is the landscape, this is the terrain, this is everything that's involved. It makes it a much more complex and rich, storytelling process.
Well, it really went against sort of how I was trained, if you will, because we, the adage that if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough, and looking for those key moments, we're spending hours or days with the same person. That's not really a possibility for what I'm doing down here. So that's something I do in assignment work or work when I'm here, but this I wanted to take a totally different approach. So it was, yeah.
How did you get that access to be able to go up in the helicopter?
Well, like I said, I think that they realized that.
You just hold it on an image.
Yeah.
So you don't have to worry about it.
Okay. They approached me and they said, "What are you working on next?" Because I think they wanted to sort of be aware of what everyone's working on, and they knew that I was doing a lot of work in the area. And they said, how can we help you? And I thought, at first I was suspicious, but then I thought, well, what would I like most from them? And that was helicopter access. There's no way I can get that otherwise. So, and I had done it once. You'll see a couple aerials from the shoot I did for the Times, and I realized how valuable it was to see things from that perspective, like this image, for instance.
Right.
So I asked them, and there was a brand new PR person that week.
For the Border Patrol?
For the Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection. And they had expanded because beforehand they had one guy handling it all. And after the summer, they couldn't do it. So he came in, and I think he didn't know what was normal or not. And I said, I'd like to do this. And he said, how many days do you need? And I was like, is he joking? So I was like, 5, like just throwing it out there. Yeah, exactly. And then he was like, well, I can't give you 5, but I can give you 4. I was like, okay. So I thought they'd give me 3 hours, and that it would be like very PR oriented. Another thing, part, I think, of the reason why they're more I work on my own, so I'm not showing up with a reporter and a notepad. Of course, I'm asking questions. Of course, I'm engaged, but I often have an agreement that I'm not going to quote anybody, and that makes the PR people calm down and basically leave me alone and do my own thing. Mm-hmm. Whereas if I have a reporter come in, things get complicated quickly, and they have to have a PR person flanking them at all times, and that 2 extra people really affects what I'm able to do.
Absolutely.
So I've found that I have more success working on my own in these particular stories.
With the images, the aerial images, and the moment where you see the downdraft from the helicopter kind of exposing these people, what happens with these images? Does Border Patrol take these as well to use, or is it
no,
you have them for yourself?
I would never allow that.
And they don't insist on them or anything.
No, actually, for this story, they did say something about whether or not they'd be able to have them for internal use, and I kind of backpedaled and never really answered them, and but I definitely told them that no, they can't have the images, and that so yeah, they didn't.
That's pretty.
Didn't take them.
That's pretty extraordinary then to be able to do that, because I feel like normally somebody wants something in return. So that's.
Yeah, I think they. Okay, so the reason why I got this access partially is because I know how to write I know how to approach them. So what I said is that and it's absolutely true, is that I want to show how they're spending the money, sure, how all of these different agencies are working together on the ground, and the only way to show that is from the air, the cooperation of these agencies. And all of those things are true, and they need this to be seen. They also need their budgets to be restored each year. So they have an interest in me being there.
Right, absolutely. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about leaving the security, or maybe not security, but being on a staff, or being staff and then moving to freelance.
Yeah.
That's a big leap and, a risk. But it sounds like in a lot of ways that kind of propelled you forward.
Yeah, it was a hard decision. When I left the paper in 2008, I don't know if any of you guys worked for papers then, but it was probably the most bleak time to look for a job. I wanted another job. I didn't feel quite ready to freelance. I didn't get a photo degree. I didn't go to a photo school. So I always felt like I was learning on the job and through workshops. So when I left, yeah, no problem. Oh, there we go. So when I left, I was concerned, for sure. And but I knew that I wasn't going to grow that much by staying at this paper.
Right.
I had been there 3 years, and so yeah, it was a calculated risk, I guess. And I decided that I would try it for 2 or 3 years in New York, and if it didn't work, then I would look for alternatives.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, though, because you go and you do this on your own, you think it kind of allows you a little bit more entry into places with since you don't have a reporter with you. But then again, you got a lot of access by having the name The New York Times behind you.
Yeah.
So what helps more? What are the pluses and minuses of both?
I think so I had worked in the area for years as part of the paper. That paper cannot get in a helicopter. That's not fair, but that is how it's done. They have to manage their resources, and so they're more willing to give better access to national publications. So I think once I came in through the national PR channel, which actually came through DC, mm-hmm. then I had the ear of the right people to pitch these stories to, and they ultimately gave me approval because I was not a pain to work with, basically. I didn't cause them a lot of problems, and there was a couple situations that I was not allowed to photograph in the detention centers, and I worked with them to not show faces in certain situations, and I had to follow their rules. And then they rewarded me by continuing to give me access. I've also, I've had some writers that I've worked with that have problems. I find it much easier to tell an image through stories and not be blamed for bias. So I've had people respond to my stories from both perspectives. They think that I'm either conservative or they think that I'm progressive, and I think that's a successful way of telling a story. So the Border Patrol has not seen any evidence of me. They haven't seen like a headline that upsets them, for instance, or a quote that they might feel misrepresents them. I just tell it through pictures, so they can't really argue with that.
Right. I mean, that's smart. And I think it sort of keeps things going. And it doesn't make you the focus of the story, which I think people can get sort of trapped by.
Sure.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you said you wanted to contribute to this dialogue about immigration. What do you think so far, if you could say, I think so far I've shown this or that, what do you think you've contributed?
Well, I think when people see the sort of physical challenges faced by migrants, that they do have a bit more sympathy. If you speak to people that they often, like you said, people have very strong opinions about this, and so I'm also careful with how I talk about it. But if people are anti-immigration, their arguments are often economic, like these people are taking our jobs, or our economy is low, we don't need any extra people here, which are, that may or may not be true. But I think it's interesting to show how much money we're spending and what that looks like. Right. And I think that when people see the duress and just the physical spaces that they actually have to traverse, that it puts them there on the ground in their shoes a bit more. I also have talked to a lot of liberal-minded people that are essentially pro-immigration, and I think they have this some have this understanding that it's almost like an underground railroad type route where people are helping their fellow migrants get into this country, and it couldn't be further than the truth. These people are exploited every step of the way. So I think that by us turning a blind eye and allowing this business of smuggling to thrive, that we should take some more responsibility for that.
Did you see a response to one series of images over another that you noticed, on the ground versus in the air?
Definitely the aerials got the strongest response. Yeah.
What was the majority of the response, or what was the difference in response?
I think a lot of people reacted by saying they didn't know that the Rio Grande was, for instance, this small, or they didn't realize how low tech some of the surveillance is. I mean, they might be in a multi-million-dollar helicopter, but they're literally looking for footprints in the sand, and that's what brings them to apprehend somebody. So I think, I think people were shocked to know that once migrants enter the river, that we're not allowed to pursue them. Right. So, and there's no cooperation from the Mexican side. So I think that people were pretty surprised to see what law enforcement is up against.
Sure. So you've documented from the American side of things, and way back when you were doing some work in Mexico, do you have any desire to document this from the other side of the border?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for instance, this is from a migrant shelter, and this was on assignment for the Times, but it was a shelter that I had visited many times. So I told the reporter about it, and we went over and visited. And there we heard firsthand accounts about how ruthless the cartels had gotten, how they're charging much more than they ever have, and that if you do not pay the fee and go with a cartel-approved guide, that you'll be beaten. So that young man had been beaten as sort of a warning sign to the other migrants to not try to cross on your own. Or to cross in an area that is not approved, because they have certain areas of the river that are approved for drugs and others that are approved for migrants. It's all extreme. Every inch is controlled by somebody. So I don't remember what
the question was, do you want to go back and do more work on the
Yes, absolutely. It's just a matter of when I go back for a limited amount of time. Right. And the next, I do want to work on a story about disappearances in Tamaulipas, and I've actually figured out that the best way to approach it is to go through Mexico City and start there, and go through the agencies there where people are a lot more open and willing to talk to me, and then from there visit Tamaulipas, because right now, if you go to any government agencies in Tamaulipas, nobody will tell you anything. Mm-hmm. Information is very controlled and very censored, and there's a high level of fear. It's a very real thing. Like just yesterday or the day before, there were gunshots in the street and like flaming vehicles, and Twitter reported that dozens were killed, and the official tally was that nobody died from the government. So that's like an example of what's going on there. Whereas in Juarez, there's always been a strong media integrity and media presence. And so I know that there are some levels of censorship, but it's nothing compared to what's happening in this part of the border.
Thinking about going and reporting from violent or dangerous areas, what do you do as a journalist what's your strategy for protecting yourself to the extent that you can?
Right. I think before I cross, I reach out to journalists on both sides of the border, journalists or colleagues, and I give a timetable for what I'm going to be doing, and then I check in immediately when I'm back across. And the cell phones actually work for a few miles into. They work well, so I can keep in touch with everybody easily. I'm just checking in constantly and making people aware of what I'm doing. I don't lie about what I'm doing, but I definitely avoid being in a situation where I have to explain what I'm doing. So, I try to stay quiet. The fears are the checkpoints, because there's sort of informal checkpoints along the roads, and you don't know what they're looking for, but you don't know who you're going to come across at those checkpoints. Right. So you minimize your times on the road, and if you're going into that area, you cross and you have a clear plan. Usually I have a taxi driver or somebody who's been vouched for, and they'll take me to wherever we decided to go, and there's, you don't stop and have lunch, you don't hang out, you just get it done and cross back. That's how I operate when I'm in Mexico, when I'm in that part of Mexico.
Right. I mean, I'm curious to hear about how everybody does this, because it's dangerous work, but I'm constantly impressed that people are still continuing to do it and tell these stories. And, I think, if you don't mind, if we can open it up to questions from the floor.
Yeah, sure.
I'd love to hear what some people in the audience are wondering about.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Thank you.
Hi. So you said to get access, you said you wanted to explore how they were spending the money, but they haven't asked for the images in return yet? You said that are they going to, or
no?
Will that just go away?
I mean, it's in, like, what I was meaning to say is that it's in their interest to have these images published showing how this money is being spent, because they need to get their budget approved each year, and they need to show that they're working. So there are ways to appeal to their interest and that also overlap with mine as a journalist, and that's where I'm always trying to find that. Like, for instance, with the Stash House pieces, I approached the Border Patrol, and they did not want me there. They didn't fully understand the issues themselves and how they were going to look, basically barging into private homes, and they were really sensitive about that. And so the local law enforcement were like, never mind, you can come with us, because we are so overwhelmed with what's going on here that we need national attention to get bigger grants so that we can pay our deputies overtime to deal with these issues. So, you can always kind of figure out who has something to gain from you being there. and that's who you appeal to get access.
So it was the national attention that they were okay with?
I think so.
Okay.
And I think they weren't thrilled when images came out about the arrests of children that they weren't able to control. So I think it makes them a bit nervous if you're working. Like, I kept circumventing them. So then I think they were like, all right, well, what do you want to do? And like kind of brought me into the fold.
Any other questions?
I actually have another question. So, how do you keep the interest up in this subject? I mean, we know it's going to be at the forefront of, I'm sure, the presidential elections. We're going to be talking about it quite a bit, but I don't know that it's always going to be on people's minds.
Sure.
Or, the coverage has already kind of died down a bit.
Definitely.
How do you think you'll approach it so that you can keep people paying attention?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm sort of constantly adapting. I'm always talking to local journalists that are my friends that work in the area, and I'm sort of gauging what is a real story and what is just being picked up by national media here and there. I think I worked on a story recently in Brooks County, which is the area where the second checkpoint is. And there I focus on all nighttime photography. It's sort of dramatically lit with flashlights. And part of the reason was because I knew that would appeal to visually minded people.
Yeah.
Like, that was an example, but sort of more dramatic imagery to complement these other photographs. I think I've just been pushing myself visually to continue the narrative. So I've done stash houses, and then I've done some aerials that really show the topography of the area. And now I'm doing the top part of the border, this last part. So I try to, when I'm pitching the stories, I try to make it a sort of approachable, packageable chapter in this longer work so that I can sustain it.
Yeah, part of my job is, I've talked about this before, but is finding those stories or those, the essays that have been shot that really will stand out visually, because unfortunately we're so oversaturated with media and photos, and I mean, it's great to have a lot of reporting done, but sometimes that can just turn people away, and I wonder if I would never want anyone to compromise their journalistic integrity by just changing the way they shoot completely to get attention. But I do wonder if, switching up your style is now something that photographers need, or thinking of it in a package level, like you say, is something that we need to kind of start considering in terms of putting pitches together. Or
I mean, because when I'm down there, I'm also shooting daily life, and and if somebody calls me about a stash house, like, I'm going to do that as well. But like when I'm approaching editors, I usually have a sort of these parameters in mind of a new, fresh perspective on the same story that we've heard before.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it definitely, immediately when I see these aerial images, the ones on the ground are beautiful. They're absolutely beautifully shot, but then there's something that just catches you because you haven't seen it necessarily before. And so I think that's a very fascinating way to think about, as a photographer, what you would do going forward, how you could reinvent the storytelling process.
Well, and because so much of these images are reliant on law enforcement access, and I'm really concerned about either glorifying or undermining the importance of what they do. So I'm constantly trying to step back and look for visual opportunities outside of whatever it is they want me to see.
Right.
So I have to sort of play within their
like that thing falls off
their
your ear all the
rules,
time.
but also looking for something different. Like the helicopters, it was really funny because all the pilots thought I was going to take pictures of them, but of course I have no interest in taking a picture of the pilot,
Right.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting to see photographers now trying to respond to what I can't put my finger on it, but there's a new visual language that I see across the web, how people interact with media. And I'm watching photographers, whether it was Glenna doing her work in Nigeria and photographing just items, or whether it's doing aerials, or, I mean, people are thinking about how, media is speaking differently. I don't know if that makes sense. So
Yeah,
I'm just sort of
absolutely.
curious to see how that'll affect photography going forward. It already seems to have, but in a very positive way, because we're seeing incredible images. And I think that's That's
Yeah, and I think you have to be careful not to be gimmicky
Yeah.
or like to do something just for the sake of pure aesthetics. But if you can marry a visually striking image with news and an actual moment of something that's happening, a moment in time where this is now, this country is seeing the militarization of the border. We're spending more money than we ever have. In 2003, the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection actually went under the umbrella of Homeland Security. So as we know, it's highly politicized how that money is being spent. So I think that Americans need to sort of see how this money is. Sorry, this
I
is
don't
really
think that's you.
distracting.
I think it's the.
Yeah, so did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Any other questions for
Yeah.
Floyd?
Hey.
Oh, great. Hi.
Hi. Thanks for doing this. Do you have any, as you continue to do this, do you have any short-term, professionally short-term, like metrics or long-term metrics that you see the work you're doing making some sort of difference? Have you started to see that already? And like maybe just personally, like when does I mean, it's all meaningful work. What do you see any changes, or do you see any like, or what would you like to see maybe in your professional opinion or just personally?
Well, yeah, I've not seen like direct changes because of my work. I have talked to people that are informed about the border, and they're now maybe more aware of these dual checkpoint systems and how they cause extra. Well, first of all, they make the journey that much more difficult and more complicated and more expensive and more dangerous for these migrants. So I think people are starting to pay attention to different migration routes and how these migrants often get funneled into situations that they have no idea. They're completely out of their control, and somebody's becoming rich by taking advantage of them along the way. So, I mean, this is a huge business. So I think people are becoming aware that by the more money we spend on enforcing these laws, like the more dangerous and underground like these situations are becoming. So we're seeing, like in Brooks County, the second checkpoint, which I don't have any images from that here, but the migrants have to actually hike through the woods and to avoid this one little vehicle checkpoint. So in the past, there wasn't that much law enforcement. They would hike for 5 miles. Now there's so much law enforcement in the area, they're hiking for 15, 20, 30 miles, and more people are dying as a result. So it's like, at what point does enforcement become, at what point are we contingent in like what's happening to some of these people? Does that make sense? And where do we draw the line? It's like, are we treating this like a militarized border? And are we saying that anyone who enters this should be, like if you take it to one extreme, should be killed? Or are we saying they should be given a chance to ask for asylum? I mean, we haven't clearly defined like how we feel about these individuals. And like when we saw 50,000 women and children crossing this summer, I think the dialogue got murky because all of a sudden, they're not breaking the law. They're not circumventing Border Patrol. They're actually turning themselves in and asking for asylum, and we just don't know what to do with them. So we put them in detention centers along with the other ones that are apprehended. So, I hope that this is adding to the dialogue, and I think that there are people that have studied the border that are now maybe seeing a glimpse of this particular stretch of the border that they didn't understand before. So hopefully I'm helping with that. Yeah, or the challenges faced by migrants and law enforcement in this particular stretch.
Any others? All right, thank you.